Hi, I'm Jeff McDonald. I'm one of the pastors here at St. Paul's United Methodist Church, and I want to welcome you to this installment of the Curley Endowment Lecture Series. I'm excited that we have joining us this evening the Reverend John Tucker. John is an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church. His bio says that he grew up in Alabama, and so he understands that fundamentalism is a threat, college football is king, and barbecue is a noun. Well, we could debate some Alabama-Texas barbecue. He and his family live in Oregon, where he serves as the district superintendent of the Crater Lake District of the Oregon-Idaho Annual Conference. Not long ago, I was listening to one of John's messages where he said that you might be a progressive Christian if you think the Bible can be both outdated and timeless all at the same time. Well, this intrigued me. And in his book, Zero Theology, he uses the notion of catch-22s to offer us a new way of looking at Christian religious life that emphasizes the non-reasonable transcendent choice over the perfectly reasonable choice of belief or unbelief. I believe this is a message that is so important to us, especially in the times that we're in. Welcome, John.
Good evening. I want to welcome you to this time tonight that we get to share with author John Tucker. And I want to begin by thanking John and Kim Watson, who started the Curley Endowment, and other people who have contributed to it over the years that makes an event like this possible. Thank you very much for your generosity. And I also want to thank the people in the room tonight who are technically making this possible. Olivia Watson, of course, our tech guru, Tim Leatherwood, John Watson, Holly Hudley, and offsite would be Richard Wingfield. So those of you who have been riding alongside me for the past few years know that an exciting and energizing turn in my own journey took place for me when I first encountered Ilia Delio at a Richard Rohr conference. Now, I can't say that I have not learned things from Ilia. I have. I've learned a lot. But that first encounter was more like experiencing someone articulate things I knew to be true, but had not yet had the ability to articulate. Now, since then, fortunately, many voices have come into my life. And if you listen to my teachings, into yours as well, Brian Swim, Daramu Demuraku, L'Oreal Rue, Michael Morwood, and many, many, many others. Their message has been, to summarize it very briefly, in light of evolutionary cosmology, we have to rethink all of our religious and spiritual categories. So for the last 3 years, we have been talking about what it means to live between two worlds, between a time when the old paradigm has lost its energy to energize and where we're groping to articulate new paths of meaning. I've called it living between the no longer and the not yet. And I'm always on the lookout for enlightened voices to guide us along the way. John Tucker is such a voice. Near the end of last year, I saw an advertisement for his book, Zero Theology, Escaping Belief Through Catch-22s. The title itself caught my attention. And then I saw what Brian McLaren, a progressive Christian whose opinion I value, had written about the book. There's something I've been trying to put into words for almost 20 years. Reading Zero Theology, I realized what it was. This book will lead you to think thoughts you have almost thought, but needed John Tucker's help to get there. I bought the book and read it. Now I've read it twice. And as soon as I finished the first reading, I found a way to get in touch with John and ask if he would be open to doing a webinar with us. He was, and this is it. So John, because I've been spending so much time with you, and we've talked some, and I've been reading you, I feel like we're old friends. And I'm so glad to have found you and your work. John describes himself as a religious thinker, and his values are clear: freedom, compassion, justice. So John is going to speak to us as long as he likes, and then he and I are going to dialogue for a bit. And I've invited Holly Hudley to join me and others in offering John questions. John Tucker, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. Take it away and have your way with us.
Well, okay. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate deeply the invitation Dr. Bill sent to me, and have enjoyed our conversations. And so I do. I'm honored to be here. It's good to know that I'm addressing a group of Texans, so I don't have to try to hide my Southern accent. I run into quite a few issues in Oregon as an Alabamian, but it's good to be here with you. And I'll talk a little bit about some issues around the book, what brought the book out, and touch on a few things. There's a lot of stuff there that can't be covered in the length of time that we have, but I'm going to try to do it justice, and hopefully in a way that is listenable. So um, the book is Zero Theology: Escaping Belief Through Catch-22s, and it took me about a year and a half to write it, but it was about 25 years in the making. And I think over time, I originally wanted to write something more confessional, kind of taking Augustine's Confessions as my model. I wanted to write something that was deeply personal and kind of just think out loud. And I kept stumbling and could not figure out how to do that. And so what happened was this book got written. So it may not be obvious, but actually lurking behind this book is very much a personal journey and my confessions, if you will. So I think it comes from several things, and I'll touch on some autobiographical information in a minute. But in this book, I'm trying to make peace with myself, and I'm trying to explore why is it that if I hang out with a bunch of religious people for too long, I really want to start hanging out with people who aren't religious. And then if I go and I hang out with people who aren't religious for too long, I find myself wanting to hang out with people who are religious. And so I feel like I'm never quite, I'm not quite a member of either camp, but I love people on both sides of that divide. And I'm trying to make sense of my own place because I've realized that I am a religious person, and I'm a religious person post belief. So it's not about believing stuff. It's not even about the rituals for me. And yet I find myself calling myself religious and feeling like that is the best way, an honest way to describe myself. So this all came about over, a 30-year journey. Started in a family that was, I will say we were naive literalist, raised Southern Baptist in the 1970s. That's borderline fundamentalism, not quite fundamentalism. That came in the 80s. And so I started there. I went through, after college, went through a period of atheism. After that, I got interested in liberation theology when I was in seminary, and then the study of the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, which is very prominent in the book, the biggest influence on my thinking. But I don't refer to him that many times, but he's definitely lurking in the book. And then I also did a stint in law school when I was thinking about making a change. And then, 20 plus years of living life as a pastor and now a district superintendent. So that's kind of the thumbnail sketch. I'll say a little bit more about my upbringing because it will lead naturally into this conversation. I was a kid who never missed church, and we were Baptist, so we went to Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night. And during one stretch, I attended Sunday school for 9 years without missing, and so I had the attendance pins that you got when you did that. And it's taken a lot of therapy to get over some of that. But I preached my first sermon at 14. I was the person that you wanted on your team if you were playing Bible trivia, Bible baseball, if some of you know what that is. So I was very steeped in kind of a naive literalist, borderline fundamentalist culture. I claimed to have been saved when I was 6 years of age, and yet throughout most of my adolescence, I was scared to death that Jesus was going to come back and take everybody and leave me behind. So that's kind of that's what starts this soup that has produced the person that I am. And then, as I say, I went to a Southern Baptist college in Alabama, in Birmingham, Samford University, and there I learned the historical critical method of studying the Bible. Also learned introduction to philosophy and things like that. And so we were studying figures that I had never come in contact with before. This is your Paul Tillix, your Karl Barths, your Rudolf Bultmanns, those kinds of folks, and it really rocked my world. And I can remember when I learned that Adam and Eve were not historical figures. I can remember lying in my bed in the dorm room that I shared with two other fellows and just weeping and not wanting them to know that I was crying, and just praying to God. How do I make sense of the world if Adam and Eve aren't real? And then my experience was I kind of prayed my way to atheism, because one benefit, I guess, to being almost a fundamentalist is you do kind of think logically about certain things. And so for me, once Adam and Eve went, then well, there was no really any need for the fall. And if there's no need for the fall, then I don't need Jesus to be born of a virgin. And if I don't need that, then I don't really need an atoning death. And if I don't need that, then I don't need Jesus to be special. And so I don't need the miracles, don't need the resurrection, don't need a judgment. And if I don't need all that, then I don't need God. And so that all happened fairly quickly for me. Um, and it wasn't traumatic as it happened, but it has caused me grief over the years as I still try to make peace with some of the things that I've come to think that were not like what I was raised to think. But anyway, I finished Samford, was a philosophical atheist, and then began reading liberation theology. I had a friend at the Divinity School in Vanderbilt who kept funneling me some of the books he was reading. And so people like James Cone, Black theology, was very significant to me. Gustavo Gutierrez, feminist theologians, Sally Faye, womanist theologian. I believe Dolores Williams was somebody that was significant in those days to me. And so it began to show me that there was a different kind of Christianity than the very narrow sliver of Christianity that I had been exposed to. And that there was much more to it than believing a bunch of stuff, because liberation theology is as much about justice and doing good in the world, and standing in solidarity with those who are oppressed, and actually talks very little about belief. And so that kind of showed me that, well, maybe I'm still a Christian after all, but I'm not sure. And then it was after seminary when I began studying Ludwig Wittgenstein, who is an Austrian philosopher who lived from 1889 to 1951 and was quite the character, and is one of the only philosophers to found two major philosophical movements. And he is the figure most often and prominently associated with the linguistic turn that happened in philosophy in the mid 20th century, he and Heidegger. The great thing about Wittgenstein is he does not write in philosophical jargon, but he writes using ordinary words. And so he was sometimes lumped into the category of an ordinary language philosopher. Those are people like Gilbert Ryle and J.L. Austin. And so his books are very interesting to read. He doesn't use jargon, doesn't use words you don't understand, but it's aphoristic and almost like a parable. And it's sometimes you're not really sure where he's going. But Wittgenstein showed me different ways of looking at language and how religious language does some things that are unique to it. That's different from scientific language, other kinds of language. He called these things language games. And it's a lot more complicated and varied than I'm giving it, but this is kind of the thumbnail sketch. And he helped me in his philosophy. At one point, he said that he used his philosophy to show the fly the way out of the bottle, and wanted to free people from confusions, linguistic confusions, conceptual traps. And I found that he did that for me. And I realized at that point in my life that atheism and fundamentalism are flip sides of the same coin. And I did not want to pick one side or the other. What I wanted to do was get rid of that coin. And Wittgenstein helped me figure out how to do that. And for the purposes of this conversation, I kind of think of that coin I name the belief paradigm. And the belief paradigm is what I'm hoping to help people escape. And it is a very difficult task. We all think in the belief paradigm. And so it's very hard to know how to say something different. And so I spend a lot of time in the book trying to figure out ways of saying something different than belief or disbelief. So that's kind of the personal journey that brought me to the book. I think one of the most important issues that I try to address um, is around something that some philosophers call basic beliefs. Now, basic beliefs are not really beliefs in the way that you and I might say, I believe Alabama's the best college football team, and you believe Texas, those kinds of things. Basic beliefs are they're not things you think of. They're not intellectual things you might hold. A good way of thinking about a basic belief is that basic beliefs are the background. They're the background against which we live our lives, and we do not think of them. I want to say that we assume them, but that also gives a false impression. An assumption is still a little bit more intellectual, and we're more self-conscious of that than we would be a basic belief. And so basic beliefs play a big role in Wittgenstein's later philosophy. Sometimes they are called hinge propositions, but for the purpose of this talk tonight, I'm going to refer to them as basic beliefs. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what they are, and then why I think it's important that we know what they are. Basic beliefs are the kinds of things that you do not discover through an investigation. They are also not the kinds of things that you can imagine doubting. So here are some examples of basic beliefs. The world existed before I was born. The world exists when I close my eyes. Human beings are mortal. One of the classic ones from philosophy, G.E. Moore, his example was, I know that I have two hands. These are the kinds of things that are in the background of our lives. We don't really believe them. We wouldn't know what it would mean to doubt them. If anybody questioned those things, we wouldn't try to persuade them that they were wrong. We would probably think that they had some type of mental issue. If you don't know you've got two hands, I don't think I can correct that problem through persuasion. That's a whole nother kind of issue. And so basic beliefs are these things that are in the background, and we don't think a lot of them. But as I say, they're there. And so it's important for us to realize that. And I think it's a good contrast with foreground beliefs. So if the background beliefs are these kind of basic things that we can't really believe or doubt, foreground beliefs are the things that we do handle. These are the beliefs that we hold. This is that I believe Alabama's best football. I believe Texas is best. These are those kinds of beliefs that we can disagree about and argue about. And they're the ones that take up our time. They're foreground beliefs. And so one of the things my book is trying to help us see is that the background has changed over time from a spiritual backdrop to a naturalistic backdrop. And it happened over centuries. The Reformation probably was part of the beginning, but certainly through the Enlightenment and then into the 19th century. What happened was we had a spiritual backdrop that existed before all that. And after all that, it shifted into a naturalistic backdrop. And so that has a significant impact on religion. And it is usually it's something we're not aware of. So that's the kind of thing that I'm trying to talk about. If you think about pre-Enlightenment societies, ancient world, for the most part, they believed in spiritual forces. And so their disagreements about the things they believed in the foreground had to do with matters of detail. Why did the gods make it rain this week and not next week? That's that kind of detail. But it's not a question of, are there gods at all? That's not the backdrop that they lived in. So foreground religious beliefs back in those days were very different from the kind of beliefs that we have today. Because we've had this shift, this naturalistic background that we now live in, the scientific world that we now live in, the beliefs that we hold out in the foreground have now become theories or explanations. And I don't think that's actually what religious life was ever supposed to be. And in order to kind of dig underneath that and figure out what that is, it's important to think about the background and think about these foreground beliefs and how they might have changed on us. For example, today, even in the most fundamentalist communities, talk about belief is going to utilize naturalistic background. They're going to talk about evidence. They're not going to talk so much about revelation. They may believe in it, but when they're out discussing their beliefs and trying to persuade people, all that stuff, it's about evidence. And evidence belongs to the naturalistic background, not the spiritual background. So in the change, evidence replaced revelation, and cause and effect has replaced kind of divine capriciousness. And so this modernistic worldview has become the background against which we live our lives. And that means that our foreground beliefs are forced to play a role of explanation or theory. And so you might have a scientific theory or explanation that somebody puts out. Perhaps Darwinism that came out. This is a theory, and it fits with its background. Unfortunately, though, what's happened post-Enlightenment for many Christians is that we've begun to believe that our religious beliefs are also theories and that they're also forms of explanation. And we do that, and we look back in primitive societies or ancient societies, and we don't realize they lived under a different set of circumstances with a different background. So their beliefs weren't explanations and weren't about evidence in the same way that ours are. So one of the things we need to pay attention to and realize is the great distance between our lives in the 21st century and lives of people in the first century. We're living in very different backgrounds, and that changes the way we have our foreground beliefs. And we're very guilty of retroactively kind of and condescendingly reinterpreting ancient peoples. Anthropologist Peter Winch, who is from the Wittgensteinian line of thought, he kept noting that Western modern anthropologists would kind of smirk when they looked at tribes in the ancient world, or even in today's world, but living in remote areas. They kind of smirk at the fact that they would do rain dances because they applied the modern Western naturalistic background view and said, look at these folks. They think that doing a dance can bring rain. Aren't they? Isn't that naive? And Peter Winch points out that that's actually not what's going on, that people who do rain dances typically only do them in the rainy season. And so they're not thinking cause and effect. They're not thinking if we do this, we can manipulate that. That's much more of a modernist way of thinking. And unfortunately, many modern day people think that that's the way prayer works. If I say the right formula, I can get the right result. So those are the kinds of things that I think we need to pay attention to. Progressivism still struggles with the belief paradigm. The belief paradigm is this trap. And the belief paradigm operates on the assumption that words are true if and only if they correspond to something in the regular world, in the outside world. And that is part of the naturalistic backdrop now. And so progressives tend to be a little bit nervous because they realize that their religious language doesn't literally correspond with things. And that makes them a little nervous because under the correspondence theory of truth, if our language doesn't match the external world, then it's false. And so one of the things progressives have done is embraced the metaphorical approach, say that religious language is metaphorical. And what they don't notice is that also is still playing by the belief paradigm because they think they're being metaphorical about something. And so what I would recommend, what I would hope, which is much more in line with what I write about in the book, is to drop the whole literal metaphorical stuff. I mean, it's accurate with doing some biblical interpretation, but to drop it as a main point and to embrace the mythical and to embrace religious living in a way that is different than the belief paradigm would have us do it. So, how do I do this in the book? Because this is kind of complicated stuff. And I hope I haven't lost you. I do it in the book a couple of different ways. I begin by setting up a comparison between stained glass windows and clear glass windows. And I suggest that these represent these backdrops that I've been talking about, and that since the Enlightenment, we live in the clear glass paradigm. And we live in the clear glass paradigm because if you think about a window, and you hope it's clean and clear, you can look out that window and see the world beyond it. And if your window is clean and clear, then what you see out there is real. And you can believe things about it, and those match up. If your window is smudged or stained, however, it gets in the way of that clarity, and now it's an unreliable window. But we live in the clear glass paradigm. If you think about scientific discoveries, the clear glass has dominated those discoveries. I mean, most of what we've done is the magnification of the eye, the extension of vision, so that we can see further, see smaller, all those kinds of things. And it carries with it this value that clarity and understanding the world as it is are what's important. And so that's the world we live in, and I don't regret that world. I live in that world too. So I'm not here to condemn it. It has offered us a lot of neat things. Some of the vaccines that are coming out now are thanks to the clear glass paradigm. But I contrast that with a stained glass window, which is actually an older form of window or a glass which was originally colored. Because stained glass windows are very different from clear glass windows. With a stained glass window, you're not supposed to look through it. That's strange. You wouldn't even think of doing that. You look at it. A stained glass window is more like a painting in a museum than it is like the window in your house. But it's more than that because as light passes through the stained glass window, it creates an atmosphere. And if you are in a room lit exclusively by stained glass windows, you know what I'm talking about. It creates a feeling of reverence and awe and beauty, and you see yourself and others in a different kind of light. And that's the guiding metaphor or model that I use in the book, that if we escape the belief paradigm, what we are escaping is trying to stick our religious language into the clear glass paradigm. Let's let our religious life be different. And you can have some discussions and debates about whether or not you can have both of those kinds of windows in the same room. I don't think you can. I don't try to merge or harmonize them because I just think that's going down the explanation road. And I'm not looking for explanations from my religious vocabulary. The other way that I do it is through the introduction of catch-22s. And this was the idea that brought the book into being, that unlocked it for me. I love Joseph Heller's book, Catch-22, and I was helping my daughter with a report that she was writing on it. And it struck me that maybe religious beliefs ought to be catch-22s. And so I wrote the book, and I'll share some of these catch-22s with you if you have not seen it. And then I'll talk about why they're important to me. So here's the first one. The first step in a religious journey is to not take the first step. The second one is the religious need is only met when you no longer need it. The third one is the only acceptable evidence for religious belief is evidence that is unacceptable. The fourth one is the only God that satisfies is the God that does not satisfy. And so those catches go on. There's 10 of them. And my goal with writing them in that way is that when you hear a paradox like that, a catch 22, it forces you to pause because it is not quickly clear what it means to agree or disagree with it. You don't know what would it mean to believe it? What would it mean to doubt it? That's not obvious. And so it forces you to pause, take a time out, and think, and maybe think some different kinds of thoughts about being religious. And I wanted to contrast that with scientific claims. A scientific claim is made, and you immediately know what it means to agree or disagree with it. Scientists would know what it means to falsify it or to confirm it. Um, I don't think our religious language should be playing the scientific language game. And I think we need to remind ourselves of that. And if we only speak in catch 22s concerning religious belief, we're not tempted to fall into what Wittgenstein would call philosophical confusion because we've been led astray by our language. And so that's one of the reasons that the main reason that I wanted to go with these catch 22s, because they are very clearly different from the belief language of most Christians. They're also very different from the disbelief language. Uh, um, Dr. Bill mentioned Brian McLaren liking the book. I'm also happy to say that uh, David Dennett, one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, also likes the book. So he's an aggressive atheist. Brian McLaren is a progressive Christian, and they both found value in the book, and that's exactly what I was going for because I kind of feel like I'm straddling the line between both of those camps, and I'm not prepared to give either one of them up. So that's kind of why I did the catch 22s, and that was the thinking around that. Um, so I think the third major uh, tool that I use in the book that I do take from Wittgenstein from a lecture that he gave, I believe in the 1930s, called Lecture on Ethics. And he spent a lot of time talking about other topics than ethics. But he talked about the difference between the relative and the absolute approach to a concept. And he used as an example one that I follow up on in my book. He used as an example of the word safe. And so if you look at the word safe, we learn the word safe in circumstances of life. That I actually don't call it the relative approach, I call it circumstantial. So from now on, I'll use absolute versus circumstantial approach. So you learn the word safe in different circumstances. You learn when it's appropriate, when it's not appropriate. And we learn these things before we acquire dictionary definitions. Dictionary definitions come in after words have been formed and learned. They kind of domesticate what was once wild. But Wittgenstein's point is you learn to use the word safe when you're feeling safe. When you're tucked in your bed at night, it makes sense to say you feel safe. The doors are all locked, makes sense. You feel safe. If you live in a country that doesn't have enemies or has a strong military, you might say that you feel safe. Those are all regular uses of the word, circumstantial uses of the word, completely appropriate. But what if you encountered somebody who used the word incorrectly and said, I'm all tucked in my bed and the doors are all locked and I don't feel safe at all? Or a situation where somebody is under great threat. The opposing army is closing and I feel so safe. That doesn't make any sense. They're misusing the word. But Wittgenstein's point is that for religious people can take a word like safe and misuse it on purpose in a transcendent way, in an absolute way. And so a religious person might say, I feel safe no matter what happens. They might couch it as, I feel safe in the arms of God. And when they're saying that, they're playing with the word safe. They're not using it the way we normally use it. What they're saying is, I feel safe even when I feel afraid. I feel safe even when I'm terrified because I live my life in the arms of God. He also applies it to wonder or gratitude. I feel we learn to say we're grateful when we have things to be grateful for. But if we can learn absolute gratitude, then we reach a place where we're thankful for life. And that's not about the list we make at Thanksgiving. That's an affirmation of what it means to be. And so these are misuses of words that we all know. And it's important that we do it on purpose because much of our philosophical confusions arise when we misuse words accidentally and we don't know that we're doing it. So I build on that quite a bit. I begin the book by talking about grief. And remember, I told you at the beginning that changing from a literalist fundamentalist through atheism into whatever it is I am now has had its share of grief, and the kind of grief that I confront is the kind of grief I think all human beings are capable of confronting, and I call it absolute grief. And I contrast it with circumstantial griefs. So I'm using the same technique with safe, but now with grief. Circumstantial griefs are the griefs that happen within life. Texas with the ice, and you just had an experience where lots of people had circumstantial griefs. COVID-19, circumstantial griefs. There's so many circumstantial ways of grieving that we have: poverty, injustice, the list goes on and on. And this kind of grief is the result of our circumstantial needs not being met. Perfectly normal to have those needs, perfectly normal and natural to feel grief when those needs are not met. And this is extremely important part of human life. And I never at any point in the book, nor at any time when I speak about this, do I want to downplay the significance of circumstantial griefs. Much of what's being done and the good work that's being done in liberation theology is focused on the circumstantial griefs of the world and how they are not given out equally. Some people have many more of them than others. So circumstantial griefs are important. They are the griefs that occur within life. Absolute grief, on the other hand, is grief that we have about life. And absolute grief can be had by anybody. Doesn't matter where you are politically, where you live, how privileged you might be. We're all capable of experiencing the existential angst that comes from recognizing and confronting our mortality, fragility, and the potential meaninglessness of life. And those are hard things to deal with. And what I want to do with zero theology is I want us, through using these techniques, the catch-22s, this absolute approach, is I want us to confront the worst case scenario. And the worst case scenario is absolute grief. And that is because the absolute need cannot be met. Our absolute grief is what it means to be human. And much of what goes on in religion, especially religious beliefs, are attempts to prevent people from confronting absolute grief because we are afraid that if they confront it, they may surrender to it. And they might. But a religious journey is a dramatic journey and it involves your whole self. So I don't expect anything less from a major risk. You have to risk. And so confront absolute grief. And so much of what I'm doing in the book is knocking down all the various kinds of beliefs that I think prevent people from confronting absolute grief. And I extend this concept to other kinds of concepts that we're all familiar with. I talk about the difference between circumstantial miracles versus absolute miracles. Virtually everything in the Bible, every example that you could give is an example of a circumstantial miracle. because they are miracles that are there to help people out of their circumstances. Not enough food, now there's plenty of food. Need to get away, now the sea is parted. So these are circumstantial miracles. Um, the only miracles I identified that I think would fall into the absolute category are the virgin birth and the resurrection of Jesus, because those are not so much about circumstances. Those get to that existential angst that we all have. And so I talk about those in my book. I spend a good bit of time on sin. One of the chapters is called You're Damned If You Do, Damned If You Don't. And that is my chapter on original sin or absolute sin, which is probably one of the first things I wrote. It's the longest chapter in the book. And it would take an entire webinar to talk about everything I mentioned in that category. But basically, it is just taking the same approach. Most of the time, we focus on our circumstantial sins and the things that we do wrong, and then we have circumstantial repentance for those circumstantial sins. And I ask us to imagine that to be human means to live in a state of absolute sin, which is not the result of anything. We didn't do anything wrong. That happens whenever people live in relationship to each other. So it's not a moral judgment. It's just a statement of fact. When you live in relationship with other people, suffering happens, unintended suffering. And it doesn't matter how you live in that system. So for me, when Jesus lived on earth, whatever you believe about virgin birth, whatever you believe about Jesus, while he was on earth, he participated in absolute sin, just like the rest of us, because there's no way to avoid it. So I talk a lot about that. I apply it to grace. Again, these are things that deserve a whole section on their own. But I think I'll close by saying that the goal in all this for me is to lead people to what I call the liberated religious life. It's one that I have not attained. I don't know that it's something you ever attain, but it's out there. It's out there like the lighthouse guiding you. And for me, the liberated religious person is the person who's courageous enough to confront the possibility of absolute grief, who spends their life constantly taking down denials, everything that would get in their way of confronting absolute grief, any beliefs that try to make that grief go away. They get rid of all that stuff. It's thoroughly getting rid of things that sometimes offer us comfort, and responding to all that with absolute wonder, courage, love, and repentance. And it is very much like walking a tightrope, because the liberated religious person lives in between the believer and the unbeliever and finds both sides tempting, but is aware that if the liberated religious person chooses either side, they get lost in the belief paradigm again, and they are denied the opportunity to confront and ultimately transcend absolute grief. So that's a very complicated book in a nutshell, and I'm sure I did not do a very good job of it. It's only 134 pages long, but it's fairly dense. So anyway, that's what I've got. I'm ready to surrender the time, Bill, if you want to. If somebody can nudge him awake.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you. I was thinking while listening to you talk tonight, we were right now at St. Paul's involved in a Bible study through the end of this month on the book of Ecclesiastes.
Oh, right.
And the book of Ecclesiastes says, as you say, you can't avoid death. It's coming.
Right. And it's one of my favorite books, which is strange to say. So anyway.
When we started, one of the pastors here, we were all saying that Ecclesiastes is the weirdest book in the Bible. And Paul Richard Kwan said, no, it's the most normal book in the Bible because it calls it like it is.
Right.
Calls it like it is.
That's right.
So I want to ask you, it seems to me that, and one of the things you say in the book is that one of the things that organized religion does is that it creates doctrines to help people avoid this essential grief that we face. Right. So what do you think the role of organized religion is in the future?
Well, what I'd like, I'm constantly told I'm naive. So just take that. I would like to see the most important things about organized religion is that it creates community. And what I would like to see are the creation of communities not held together by religious beliefs, but held together by common commitment to authenticity and sharing what it means to be human with each other, while also not forgetting the circumstantial griefs in the world. And we owe something ethically to those others. I would love to see it become that. The jury is out whether those kinds of churches can ever exist. Maybe that's the kind of thing you're doing. But that's what I would like to see. And churches should be where we could be our most vulnerable, real selves. And frequently, they are the places where we are the least vulnerable and real for fear of judgment.
So I noticed that I made pages and pages of notes on your book, and I noticed that there are phrases that occur over and over in the book about your emphasis on compassion
Right.
and justice, that those are very important qualities to you. So I'm going to risk a really personal question.
Okay.
And those people who have heard me will not be surprised by this question at all. Do you have a daily spiritual practice that nurtures your life about this? And if so, what is it?
I, So let me say that I am the most unroutine, unritualized person you've ever met. But I do things that I think would qualify. I almost every day spend time writing and working on music and just thinking. I do those kinds of things. That's kind of my contemplative life, my meditative life. But I don't really do any of the things that normally get categorized as spiritual. I don't really think of myself as spiritual. That's a word that has a lot of baggage for me. But I do like. That's why I like being religious. I'm religious, and what that means is also up for discussion. But yeah, I'm a poetic person. Let's put it that way.
Well, that's the role that you think that theology should take in the future, is to give up theological explanations and turn to poetry.
Absolutely, that's exactly right. I get out of the explanation business and instead express something real about what it means to be human. I'm not suggesting we give up all content. I mean, things matter. How we think about variety of things matter. But I do like the poetry that moves you, that expresses something about what it means to be a human being at this time. I think I say in my book that when Jesus is on the cross and screams out, "Why, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That's theology. And talking about it is two steps removed from the vulnerability of feeling it, So yeah, that's kind of where I am.
So, Holly, do we have questions?
We do. I'm going to tie together a few here because they relate. And they have to do with removing these barriers of religious language, removing the barriers of Genesis, of sin, of Jesus as God. What is the common community that let's say the church comes together around? Right. And how does one gain that courage or encouragement to live this liberated path?
Oh, that's a good question. I wish I knew the answer to that second part. I don't know the answer. And, I've had a lot of conversations about what brings communities together when you give up these certain kind of doctrinal points along the way. I tend to think of doctrines and beliefs as these are places in the past where people found buried treasure. And they're like pirates' maps. And so, we found a buried treasure here with this doctrine. And it said something about the human condition. But that doesn't mean that we can keep going back to them over and over again and find them equally meaningful. So they surprise us in all sorts of ways. So I would envision, something that may not look like church. That people are coming together for different kinds of reasons than people have gathered in the past. Again, I would hope it would be around common commitments to justice, common commitments to authenticity and vulnerability. But But I don't take lightly. It is a big deal to give up some of these things, especially when we've built our lives around them. So
Mhm. One of the things Bill and I talk a lot about is deconstructing to reconstruct. And sometimes it is tempting to throw the whole baby out with the bathwater, because it is so hard to let go of some of these paradigms. But one of the things that you talked about in the book was kind of this transfer of human being to human doing. And that was sort of this idea of original sin, right? Or original blessing, if you will.
Right.
And I'd love to hear you tease apart that sort of relational space, ethical space, evil, that kind of how
yeah, that's the thickest part of the book. So this was all inspired. I'll start with how it was inspired by taking criminal law in law school. And in law school, I mean, in our legal system, there are such things as public welfare offenses or strict liability offenses, where you can be held responsible legally for something you did not intend to do. You intended no wrong. Did not intend to break a law. But because the harm that's done is so great, our system has decided you're still going to be prosecuted, and if convicted, punished. And so that got me to thinking about, what if original sin is something more like that? So what if, Augustine and what's his name? I'm losing the.
Thomas Aquinas?
No, his opponent. I mentioned him in the book. I'm losing the name.
Right.
Anyhow, Pelagius, Augustine and Pelagius arguing about that they're both kind of right and they're both kind of wrong, and I actually mentioned that in the book. But so for me, human being is it's preconceptual. It's hard to imagine what that would mean. It's us without judgment based on what we do. And so if you want to talk about the fall was from being to doing. Now, unfortunately, we would not recognize, I'm not sure we'd recognize human beings as human beings. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't speak our language. I spend a lot of time talking about how the Adam and Eve myth is not comprehensible to us. If we take it seriously, we could not interact with those characters because they're just in a very different world. So I liked the being and the doing thing, because it made me, I liked when I thought, when Adam and Eve attempted to be what they already were, they failed. And if you attempt being, you can only fail at doing. And so that's the transition. So since then, it's all about doing, and doing matters. Justice matters. Those kinds of things matter. So it's a way of talking about how we interact with each other. Ethical space for me is those relationships where we owe people our best selves, justice, those kinds of things. Relational space is larger than ethical space, because we all inhabit the web of relational space, and we cause harm even when we don't mean to. It may be through counterfactuals or omission, but I'm sitting here with you tonight. I'm not doing anything wrong, but who knows what I might have done with this time had I not been here with you tonight. I might have prevented some harm. So that's the best.
This idea of like we fall from being to become doers to get back to our nature of being.
Yeah, we're
Who
caught.
Teach this to a child.
Well, we're caught in that. And what I do is, and the move I make is that for us, Jesus mm-hmm. plays the role of the visionary leader who is in the doing community. I mean, that's the incarnation. Is transcendence is now living amongst the doers. And so Jesus is our call to discipleship, to doing. But when we want to interact with the God beyond God, that is the God of being. And that's a God that an absolute judge, as I think I say in the book, an absolute judge always grants mercy. Mm. And so they're figures that, they relate in a very unique kind of way, trying to combine that being doing thing that you noticed. So Yeah, I like that part of the book, and I need to read it again myself.
Yes, that's the one I have to kind of keep with a bit. Bill, there's a couple more questions that are popping up. I did find this interesting. Number one, how we think so much of, I'm a parent of three, and we haven't really indoctrinated our kids with much of anything except for be kind.
Right.
And that seems to me the most worthy thing I can teach them at this point in their life. But what in order to sort of live the life of unbelief, where do we begin with children?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And, we have conversations out here in Oregon, Idaho all the time with all the, we're all very progressive out here, so, and so the clergy are progressive clergy, and none of us have kids that go to church. And so we don't, I'd like to talk about that more deeply about why is that the case? My children, I don't think will go to church. So somehow we figured out a way to inculcate values without certain trappings. I do think something is lost. Those stories mean a lot to me. I think in terms of those stories. I mean, how you raise kids where those stories mean something, where if they don't have to begin by taking them as historical, literal, I don't know. But I do wish that, my kids read Harry Potter when it came out, and as so many of us did. I stayed up all night reading those things.
My favorite.
And I wish that the scene where Harry Potter in the last book walks into the forest to his death, and he whispers, he says, "I'm about to die." It's very moving. It's been a long time since the Jesus stories moved me. I've heard them. I've heard them, and I've heard them, and I've heard them. I wish I could. I wish I could encounter the Bible the way many kids and adults encounter something like Harry Potter. Something that reaches out and touches me and reminds me of what it is to be human. We've so elevated the Bible, we've so elevated Jesus that they're almost beyond relatability. So that's the challenge. I don't know if y'all probably know the name Fred Craddock, who was a great homiletic professor. He used to say the challenge is how do you speak the gospel to people who've heard it all before? And that's that. I don't know the answer. And raising kids, good luck. I don't know. The jury's still out. So
Bill's agreeing here now. He gets off the hook.
My belief is that in the very beginning, and you say in your book something that true to this day, is that Jesus fares a lot better than Christianity does.
Right.
And I think that what the community, I would talk about the community of the future, or the community that we need to shape, need to be shaped by the same thing that the community around Jesus was shaped in the beginning, and that is around common joy and common support and common compassion, celebrating the events of life together, of birth and death and unions, and upholding one another in times of sadness and distress and celebrations of joy. It was not built around a belief. It was built around human experience.
Right, and also under circumstances of fear and of persecution, and those things are. I don't know that we have all the ingredients in our current culture to have the recipe to work.
So, before we let you go, there is one question in the book that I would like to ask you to clarify on. It's changing a subject quite a bit, but what's the difference between making judgments and passing judgments?
Oh, I knew somebody was going to ask me that. I need to brush it. Okay, so let me make sure I get this right. So I use that distinction to say that you make judgments. Judgments go to actions, and they go to actions that people do that you consider to be in your community, because you are in that community around some type of agreed, social contract or something about how you're going to live your life. And so you can make judgments about people. And in fact, that's one of the ways the community has identity. If you get rid of all that stuff, there's no identity holding the community together. So made judgments are made by members of a community of each other, and it goes to their actions. You didn't do that right. Whereas past judgments go towards people. and they are kind of utter kind of condemnations, not of your action, but of you. And when I say that, I am saying you are not a member of my community. So a past judgment is also a banishment, an ostracizing kind of act. And so yeah, that's kind of where I go with those, because there's not a whole lot of stuff that I've come across that parses the concept of judgment, because the passing judgment is also necessary for human community. I think I say made judgments patrol the interior, the essential kind of what the essentials. Past judgments control the border, and they help define the community. And it's very hard to throw those out and keep community. So that's just another example of original sin. You can choose one of those to do, and when you do it, when you do that one, you commit the other one. So that's that kind of thing. So I don't know if that's clear as mud, but anyway.
Okay. Holly, we have more questions?
Yeah, one more thing I'd love to raise, or I'm sure there's many more actually, but we can say one more thing. I really appreciate that for you, the liberated religious life, and please tell me if I'm interpreting this wrong, rests in those vulnerable spaces and the vulnerability of our humanness. And what was it that you said, that the primitive cry, that sort of primitive cry of religion that maybe makes us cry mama in the nighttime,
Right.
Or oh God, why have you forsaken me?
Yeah.
And that vulnerability, that space in between, if you will, is there, which in Plato's Symposium is what was called love.
Right.
Absolutely. And and that's a really vulnerable space to live in. So there's this vulnerability on the one hand, and then there's this rise in fundamentalism on the other hand. So I'm kind of holding someone's question into that statement.
Yeah.
How do you sort of live with that tension?
Well, probably because I live with the person I live with, vulnerability is high on our priorities. Brene Brown, we watch her. I think I speak, and maybe this goes back even to my childhood in a church that was borderline fundamentalist, even, is that religion, I think it's a mistake to think that religion is fundamentally intellectual, that it is something that comes from us when we're real, when we cry. You don't have to call that religious. I'm not forcing people to call it that, but it can be if you accompany those behaviors with a certain type of language. I think, and that helps me avoid explanation. That's why I'm not looking to unite science and theology and bring harmony and all. I'm not looking for those kinds of explanations. I'm wanting the religious life to be something that, whatever the facts are, they are. It doesn't touch it, because I'm not making any claims about it. I'm gonna respond to it like a human being and try to respond out of vulnerability rather than defensiveness, which is tough for white males sometimes. So.
So one of the things that I got from reading your book, and I'm asking you if this is a correct reading, is that if we're going to transcend the belief paradigm, we have to give up being either progressive or conservative.
Well, no, because it's because those words are. If I take those words to be about ethics, then no, you don't. You could be, I'm a liberated religious progressive. I don't know what it would mean to be a liberated religious conservative. That's an interesting thought experiment to say. I think it's possible, but I'm really thinking more about the religious backdrop to life more so than I am the behaviors that we do. I've often thought that the one miracle Jesus could not pull off was this loving God and loving neighbor as the same thing. Though we want them to be the same thing, but they're not the same thing. And I think it's that tension that's present in what I'm trying to communicate here. The liberated religious life is kind of you're wrestling with God, but you're still on the hook for how you behave with your neighbors and your, folks like that.
Being a liberated religious person
Mm.
really is being a person who transcends the belief paradigm.
You don't do anything because you have to, because there's a belief compelling you to do it. You're not afraid, you're not fearful for your soul. You're not trying to gain the favor of a deity. You're over that, and you do it because you recognize you're part of a vulnerable species, and we need each other. And and I'm okay with people. I don't say in the book that you absolutely have to adopt these worst case scenarios. Uh, and nobody can live that way. But what I want to say is, you at least need to be able to think that, to consider that in your thought life. And that's why I compare it so much to Job. Job lost everything and yet remained religious in some way. And so, what if you lost everything that our current world calls religious? What if you lost all of that stuff? Um, that's what the liberated religious person is contemplating, I think, if that makes sense.
So Job is your patron saint.
Yeah, I like Job. I do like Job. He's real. So,
Anything else, Holly? We're going to go.
There's so much richness, and I feel like we could probably go through chapter by chapter, but then we would just be probably in the weeds where people would be like, wait, I haven't gotten there yet.
I'd love to talk about some of that other stuff, but it's just can't,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. It's so rich. And I think, when I think about your times, I used to say deliberation theology, which is a huge interest and influence of mine. James Cone is someone who's been a recent influence. I think that one of the things we have to sort of learn how to be liberated from is this kind of white male Protestant religion.
Right.
And that is hard when you're mostly white folks dealing with white male Protestant religion. And how do we sort of live with this idea of liberation from it in order to achieve the liberated religious life? And if we do, are we co-opting something?
Right.
So,
I'm right there with you. And it bothers me. And I don't claim to be so widely read in the field, but it bothers me that most of the people I come across in analytical philosophy of religion, tend to be white males. I've really enjoyed finding women Wittgensteinian philosophers, because that bothers me. That we need more voices doing work like this. So.
Agreed.
Well, it's clear that one paradigm that we've been living with for a long time is coming to an end.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
Yes.
And in one of the conversations you and I had, you describe yourself as a religious thinker. That's what you like to do. And I'm grateful for your religious thinking. It's been liberating and helpful to me. I love your book, and I really am grateful. I hope that when this pandemic time is over, we figure out a way to get you to come to Houston.
Oh, I'd love that. Yeah.
I mean,
then we
it's
can
so
dive
cool
in. We
here.
can dive into that original sin. Oh, that would be great. But I appreciate this opportunity. I really do appreciate it.
So I want to close with this. One of my favorite poets wrote some of my favorite words that I think of in times like this. The poet is Rainier Maria Rilke, and this is what he wrote. Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves. Like locked rooms and like books that are now written in a very foreign tongue. Do not seek the answers which cannot be given you because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. And perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer. That is what I think John Tucker describes as a liberated religious person. John, thank you for giving us a way to live the questions. Thank you for your book. Thank you for your time tonight. And thank you for being. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
Appreciate it.
so much, John.
Good night, all.